What happens when crossing one forbidden line threatens to destroy everything? One decision shattered my marriage, my trust, and my sense of self. Can a moment of weakness be forgiven, or will it define me forever? Stay tuned to uncover the truth, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. End of story 21. The wineglass trembled in my hand, half empty but still sloshing with the weight of what I had just done. I could hear the faint hum of my husband's car pulling into the driveway, his usual punctuality a cruel reminder of the life I was supposed to be living. My heart hammered against my chest, each beat louder than the sound of his key turning in the lock. How had it come to this? When I looked at myself in the reflection of the darkened window, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. She was disheveled, cheeks flushed, eyes wild with a cocktail of guilt and exhilaration. My stepbrother's scent still clung to my skin, a mix of his cologne and something more primal. I felt an urge to scrub every inch of myself clean, yet at the same time I couldn't help but linger in the memory of his touch. "Claire?" my husband called out from the foyer, his voice warm and oblivious as always. I swallowed hard, forcing my hands to steady. "Up here," I replied, surprised by how steady I sounded. I wasn't ready to face him. Not yet. But I wouldn't have to, not immediately. I would have time to change, to erase any trace of the forbidden moment I had just shared. Yet no matter how quickly I acted, no amount of soap or makeup could erase the weight of what had already happened. The real question wasn't if he'd find out, but when. And worse still, what would I do when he did? It started like most things, so innocently. My husband and I had been married for 8 years. John was a good man, stable, reliable, predictable. He worked long hours as an investment banker, a profession that came with a hefty paycheck, but little time for anything else. I spent most of my days alone, managing the house and indulging in hobbies that no longer sparked much joy. Ours wasn't an unhappy marriage, but it wasn't exactly thriving either. Then, 2 weeks ago, Mark arrived. Mark was my stepbrother, though we'd never grown up together. Our parents had married when we were already in our late teens, and by then we were both too old to form any kind of sibling bond. He was younger than me by 3 years, with an easygoing charm and a mischievous streak that had always made me both wary and intrigued. He had been traveling for years, working odd jobs and picking up gigs as a photographer. When he called to say he was passing through town, my husband was the one who insisted he stay with us for a while. "He's family," John had said, though the word had always felt like a stretch to me. Mark arrived with a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a grin that made me feel unexpectedly self-conscious. He was tanned from his travels, his dark hair messy but somehow deliberate, and his blue eyes carried that same spark of mischief I remembered from our younger days. "Scarface." "Claire?" he said warmly, pulling me into a hug as he stepped through the door. His touch lingered just a second too long, though I told myself I was imagining it. "I won't be going back." "Mark," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Welcome to the quiet life." He laughed, his eyes scanning the house. "Not too quiet, I hope." John clapped him on the shoulder, oblivious as ever. "She'll keep you in line. Trust me, she runs a tight ship around here." I forced a polite laugh, but something about the way Mark's gaze lingered on me made my stomach flutter. Over the next few days, I found myself hyper-aware of Mark's presence. He was always there, lounging on the couch, cooking in the kitchen, or sitting on the back porch with a cigarette in hand. It wasn't just his physical presence that unsettled me. It was the way he looked at me. He had a way of making mundane interactions feel charged, A simple pass the salt at dinner felt like an invitation to something more. When he brushed past me in the hallway, his touch seemed deliberate, though he always played it off with an easy smile. John, of course, noticed none of this. He was as busy as ever, leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, but the tension between Mark and me was palpable, growing with every passing day. It all came to a head one evening when John was working late. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and Mark wandered in, shirtless and casual, as if he belonged there. "Need any help?" he asked, leaning against the counter. His voice was low, almost teasing. I glanced at him, my eyes flicking over his bare chest before I could stop myself. "No, I'm fine," I replied, my voice a little too sharp. He smirked, clearly catching my slip. "You sure? You seem tense." I turned back to the cutting board, gripping the knife a little tighter. "I'm fine," I repeated, though my heart was racing. He moved closer, his presence overwhelming. "You don't look fine," he said softly, his breath warm against my neck. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming at me to step away, to put distance between us. But I didn't move. I saw the ripples of his worry, and they started spreading down my back as he lifted his head. The moment was interrupted by the sound of John's car pulling into the driveway. Mark stepped back, his expression unreadable, and I felt both relieved and disappointed. As I watched him leave the room, I realized two things. I was in dangerous territory, and I wasn't sure I wanted to leave it. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and awareness. Mark seemed to sense the shift in me, how I lingered a little too long in the kitchen when he was there, how my eyes darted toward him when I thought no one was looking. It was as though we were playing a game neither of us wanted to name. John's work schedule had become even more grueling, leaving Mark and me alone for long stretches. I told myself I was imagining the tension, that it was harmless. After all, wasn't it natural to feel flattered by the attention of someone so carefree and confident? It didn't mean anything. At least, that's what I repeated to myself the night Mark found me on the porch. It was late, and the summer air was heavy with the scent of jasmine. I'd poured myself a glass of wine, hoping it would quiet the restless thoughts that had taken root in my mind. Mark appeared like a shadow, his presence both startling and inevitable. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, sliding into the chair next to me. He carried a beer in one hand, his fingers wrapped casually around the neck of the bottle. "No," I admitted, swirling the wine in my glass. "You?" He shrugged. "Too much on my mind, I guess." I turned to him, curious despite myself. "Like what?" His eyes met mine, and for a moment I felt completely exposed. "You," he said simply. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. My breath caught, and I looked away, focusing on the darkened horizon. "Don't," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" he asked, leaning closer. His tone was soft, almost coaxing. "We're adults, Claire. We know what this is." I shook my head, the motion as much for him as it was for myself. "It's wrong." "Is it?" His voice was barely audible now, his breath brushing against my cheek. "Or is it just complicated?" I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden deck. "I can't do this," I said, my voice trembling. "To a man who barely sees you," Mark countered, standing as well. "When's the last time you felt alive, Claire? Really alive?" I stared at him, torn between the truth in his words and the weight of what they meant. Go to bed, Mark, I said finally, turning away. Please. He didn't follow me, but his silence was louder than any argument could have been. The next morning, I tried to pretend nothing had happened. I busied myself with chores, keeping as much distance between Mark and me as the house would allow. But avoidance wasn't a sustainable strategy, and by mid-afternoon I found myself cornered in the living room. Mark was sprawled on the couch, flipping through a book he'd found on the coffee table. When I walked in, he looked up, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, crossing my arms over my chest. "It was a mistake." "Was it?" he asked, sitting up. "Because it didn't feel like one." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I hated how easily he could unravel me. "You're my stepbrother," I said, as though the label could somehow negate the pull between us. "And we barely knew each other before this," he countered. "We're not kids, Claire. We can make our own decisions." I shook my head, the weight of his gaze making it hard to breathe. "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think," he interrupted, standing. He closed the distance between us in a few steps, his presence overwhelming. "And I know you feel it too." I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came. Instead, I found myself looking at him, really looking at him, and the realization hit me like a freight train. I did feel it. The connection, the attraction, the undeniable pull that seemed to draw us together no matter how hard I tried to fight it. But acknowledging it didn't make it right. The recognition that she was hurt. "Mark," I began, but he silenced me with a finger to his lips. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "Just..." That evening, John called to say he'd be working late again. I hung up the phone with a mixture of relief and dread, knowing that the extra time alone with Mark would only complicate things further. Sure enough, he found me in the kitchen, my hands shaking as I tried to focus on preparing dinner. "Let me help," he offered, his voice gentle. "I'm fine," I replied, though the quaver in my voice betrayed me. He didn't listen, stepping closer and taking the knife from my hand. "Relax," he said, his touch lingering for just a moment too long. "I've got it." I watched as he chopped the vegetables with practiced ease, the rhythm of the blade against the cutting board strangely soothing. "You're good at that," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He glanced at me, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I've had a lot of practice," he said. "You pick up all kinds of skills on the road." His tone was casual, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, something that made my pulse quicken. I turned away, trying to busy myself with setting the table, but the air between us felt charged, electric. By the time dinner was ready, I could barely look at him. He, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, as though nothing had happened. It was infuriating and intoxicating all at once. As we sat down to eat, I felt the weight of his gaze on me, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't something I could simply ignore. The line had already been crossed, whether I wanted to admit it or not. The air in the house was heavy, as if it carried the unspoken tension that Mark and I refused to acknowledge outright. John's long hours at work became both a blessing and a curse. His absence left more time for temptation to creep in, but it also reminded me of the life I was dangerously close to unraveling. Mark, on the other hand, seemed entirely unaffected by the weight of what we were dancing around. He was playful, charming, and completely disarming. He spent his days sprawled across the couch or tinkering with his camera, occasionally teasing me with a grin, that felt like a dare. "You're avoiding me," he said one afternoon, catching me as I attempted to slip past the living room unnoticed. "Until I'm busy," I replied, clutching the laundry basket to my chest like a shield. "Too busy to talk to me?" He stood, blocking my path with that maddening ease of his. I sighed, my grip tightening on the basket. "What do you want, Mark?" His smile faded, replaced by something more serious. "You know what I want." The honesty in his voice was like a punch to the gut. "Mark, we can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, stepping closer. "You keep telling yourself it's wrong, but have you even stopped to think about why you feel that way?" "Because it is," I said, though my conviction felt thin, even to me. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, and I felt that same electric jolt I'd been trying to ignore for days. "Claire," he said softly, his voice almost pleading, "you deserve more than this." "No, I don't," I whispered, too exhausted. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned and fled, leaving him standing in the hallway with his hands in his pockets and a look of quiet determination on his face. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening. John had called to say he'd be late again, and I found myself alone in the house with Mark, the sound of the rain pattering against the windows amplifying the silence between us. I was curled up on the couch, a book in my lap that I wasn't actually reading, when Mark appeared in the doorway. He hesitated for a moment before crossing the room and sitting beside me, his presence so close it made my skin prickle. "What are you reading?" he asked, his voice low. I closed the book, not even bothering to pretend I could focus. "Nothing important." Ah. He reached out, taking the book from my hands and setting it on the coffee table. "Then, talk to me." "About what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "About why you're so scared." His gaze was steady, and I hated how easily he could see through me. "I'm not scared," I lied, though the tremor in my voice gave me away. He leaned closer, his eyes locked onto mine. "Yes, you are. You're scared of what you're feeling, scared of what it means." I shook my head, but the motion felt weak. "Mark, please," loosened. He silenced me with a kiss, his lips soft but insistent against mine. For a moment I froze, every rational part of me screaming that this was wrong. But then something inside me broke, and I kissed him back, my hands tangling in his hair as years of suppressed longing spilled over. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing hard, our foreheads pressed together as the reality of what we'd just done sank in. "We can't," I said, though the words felt hollow. "We already have," he replied, his voice steady, "and you know you don't regret it." The next morning was both a blur and a stark contrast to the night before. The house felt different, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the consequences of our actions to catch up with us. Mark was nowhere to be seen, and for a brief moment, I wondered if he'd left altogether. But then I found him in the kitchen, casually leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee in hand. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said, his tone almost too casual. I nodded, unsure of what to say. The weight of what had happened between us was too heavy to ignore, yet I couldn't bring myself to confront it. "John will be back soon," I said finally, as if the reminder of my husband's impending return would somehow erase the memory of Mark's lips on mine. Mark didn't respond immediately. Instead, he set down his coffee and crossed the room to stand in front of me. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. I wanted to tell him I was fine, that everything would go back to normal. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded, though the tears welling in my eyes betrayed me. "Claire," he said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my face, "you don't have to pretend with me." His kindness was both a comfort and a curse, and I found myself leaning into his touch despite everything. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. From the purest heart, he brought me safety. "You don't have to know right now," he said. "Just don't shut me out." I nodded again, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to breathe. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between Mark and me only grew more complicated. What had started as a single stolen moment spiraled into something neither of us could control. John's long hours at work left plenty of opportunities for us to be alone, and though I tried to resist, Mark always found a way to pull me back into his orbit. It was a Tuesday evening when the lines blurred even further. John had called to let me know he'd be working late, again, and Mark suggested we order takeout. I agreed, trying to keep things casual, but the moment he sat across from me at the dining table, the air between us felt charged. "You've barely touched your food," Mark said, his eyes studying me. "I'm not hungry," I replied, pushing my plate away. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving mine. "Is it me?" "No," I said quickly, though the answer felt complicated. "It's not you. It's everything." Ink. Mark nodded, as though he understood more than I was willing to say out loud. "You can talk to me, you know," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." His words felt both comforting and dangerous. "That's the problem," I muttered, my voice barely audible. "It's a good song." "Good song." "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward. I hesitated, torn between the desire to confess everything and the fear of what it might mean. "You're making this harder than it has to be." Mark's expression softened, and he reached across the table to take my hand. "Maybe it's supposed to be hard," he said. "Maybe that's how you know it's real." His words struck a chord deep within me, and before I could stop myself, I was standing, pulling him to his feet. The next thing I knew, we were in the living room, his hands on my waist, his lips on mine. And all the reasons why we shouldn't do this faded into the background. The following morning, reality came crashing back with a vengeance. John had come home earlier than expected, and the sound of his car pulling into the driveway sent a jolt of panic through me. "Mark, you need to go," I hissed, shoving him toward the back door. He hesitated, his brows furrowing in concern. "Claire, just go," I insisted, my voice trembling. "Please." Reluctantly, he slipped out the door just as John walked in, his tie loosened and his briefcase in hand. "You're up early," he remarked, glancing at me. "I couldn't sleep," I said quickly, hoping he wouldn't notice the nervous edge in my voice. John nodded, clearly too exhausted to question me further. "I'm going to take a shower," he said, disappearing down the hall. I exhaled shakily, my heart still racing. The relief was short-lived, though, as I realized how close we'd come to being caught. This was a warning, I told myself, a sign that I needed to end whatever was happening with Mark before it destroyed everything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. That afternoon, John suggested we invite Mark to dinner. He's been staying with us for weeks, he said. It's the least we can do. I agreed, though the idea of sitting across from Mark with John right there felt like a nightmare. When Mark arrived, he greeted John with his usual easygoing charm, but when his eyes met mine, I saw the flicker of something deeper. The dinner was a minefield of stolen glances and hidden meanings. John, oblivious as always, chatted about work while Mark and I danced around the unspoken truth between us. At one point, Mark's knee brushed against mine under the table, and the spark it sent through me was almost unbearable. "Claire," John said suddenly, pulling me from my thoughts. "You okay?" I forced a smile, nodding quickly. "Just tired." John gave me a sympathetic look before turning his attention back to Mark. "So, any plans for the future?" he asked. Mark hesitated, his eyes flicking toward me before answering. "I'm still figuring things out." "Oh," John laughed, shaking his head. "Typical. You've always been the free spirit." I excused myself shortly after, retreating to the kitchen under the guise of cleaning up. Mark followed a few minutes later, his presence both a comfort and a reminder of everything we stood to lose. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. "No," I admitted, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "This is too much." Mark stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "Claire?" "Don't," I said, though my resolve was crumbling. "John's right there, and he doesn't see you," Mark said softly. "Not the way I do." His words were like a knife to my heart, and I hated how much I wanted to believe them. The days that followed were marked by an uneasy tension I couldn't shake. John, usually so absorbed in his work, had started to notice the subtle shifts in my behavior. It wasn't anything overt, just a lingering look, a too long pause when I answered his questions, but I could feel his suspicion growing. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, John leaned against the counter, watching me. "You've been quiet lately," he remarked, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. "Just tired," I replied, avoiding his gaze. He nodded slowly, though I could tell he wasn't convinced. "Mark's been around a lot," he said after a moment. "Do you think he's overstaying his welcome?" "Not really." The question caught me off guard, and I fumbled with the knife in my hand. "No," I said quickly. "He's family." John's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression unreadable. "Still, it's unusual. You two seem close." She gasped. I froze, the weight of his words settling over me like a lead blanket. "He's your stepbrother," John continued, his voice calm but probing. "I trust there's nothing I should worry about?" The knife slipped from my grasp, clattering against the cutting board. "Of course not," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Don't be ridiculous." But the look John gave me lingered long after he'd left the room. That weekend, John decided to work from home. It was a rare occurrence, one that threw my carefully balanced world into disarray. With him constantly underfoot, every interaction with Mark became a calculated risk. By Sunday afternoon, the tension had reached a breaking point. I was folding laundry in the bedroom when Mark appeared in the doorway, his expression a mixture of frustration and determination. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Not now, I hissed, glancing toward the open door. John's downstairs. Mark stepped inside, closing the door behind him. I don't care, he said. This isn't working. What isn't working? I demanded, though I already knew the answer. Oh, this, he said, gesturing between us, pretending like nothing's happening, hiding how we feel. I shook my head, panic rising in my chest. You don't understand. No, you don't understand, he interrupted, his voice fierce. I'm in love with you, Claire, and I can't keep pretending like I'm not. His words hit me like a freight train, leaving me breathless. Mark, stop, I said, my voice trembling. This isn't fair. What's not fair, he said, stepping closer, is you denying what we both know is real. I didn't have a chance to respond before the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. My heart seized as the door opened, and John stepped inside, his gaze flicking between Mark and me. What's going on? He asked, his tone calm but edged with suspicion. Nothing, I said quickly, forcing a smile. Mark was just leaving. John's eyes lingered on me for a moment before turning to Mark. Is that true? Mark hesitated, his jaw tightening before he nodded. Yeah, he said, his voice flat, just catching up. As he left the room, the weight of John's gaze bore down on me. You sure there's nothing I should know? He asked, his tone softer now, but no less pointed. I shook my head, my throat tight. Of course not. No time like the present, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. That night, as John slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with the events of the day, the weight of Mark's confession pressing heavily on my chest. I knew I needed to make a choice, but the path forward felt impossibly tangled. The call to action, gently built. The next morning, I found Mark in the kitchen, his back to me as he poured a cup of coffee. We can't keep doing this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His shoulders rose and he turned, savoring my words, his eyes brimming over. He turned, his eyes meeting mine. You're right, he said. So, what are we going to do? I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. You need to leave, I said finally, the pain of the admission cutting through me like a blade. Mark's expression hardened, though I could see the hurt in his eyes. Is that what you really want? It's what I have to do, I said, though the conviction in my voice wavered. For John. For us. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and the silence between us was deafening. Then he nodded, his jaw clenched. Okay, he said, his voice tight. If that's what you want. As he walked past me, I felt the weight of finality settle over me. But even as I watched him leave, a part of me couldn't help but wonder if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. The house felt emptier without Mark, and the absence was like a wound I couldn't stop picking at. John seemed unaware of the change at first, too busy with his own work to notice the subtle shifts in my demeanor. But I knew. The tension was there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. At first, it only affected me, and then we all felt it. It came one evening as we sat down to dinner. The silence between us was heavier than usual, and I could feel John watching me as I pushed food around my plate. Finally, he broke the silence. Claire, he said, his voice measured. What's going on with you? I looked up, startled. What do you mean? "You've been distant lately," he said, leaning forward. "Distracted. It's like you're not even here." "I've just been tired," I replied, though the excuse sounded hollow even to my own ears. John studied me for a moment, his gaze piercing. "Is it because of Mark?" Then he saw the flicker of a smile on my lips and winked. The question hit me like a slap, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. "Why would it be because of Mark?" I asked, forcing a laugh. "You tell me," John said, his tone sharper now. "He's been staying here for weeks, and then suddenly he's gone. What happened?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth was too heavy to speak, and the lies felt too tangled to navigate. "Claire," John pressed, his voice low, "is there something you need to tell me?" I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. "No," I said quietly, "there's nothing." But the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. The tension between John and me only grew in the days that followed. He started coming home earlier, his presence a constant reminder of the secret I was desperately trying to bury. I could feel him watching me, his questions unspoken but ever present. One evening, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, John appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Claire," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I need to know the truth." I hesitated, my hands gripping the fabric in my lap. "About what?" "About you and Mark," he said, stepping into the room. "I'm not blind, Claire. I've seen the way you look at him, the way he looks at you." Panic surged through me, and I struggled to keep my composure. "You're imagining things," I said, my voice trembling. "Am I?" he asked, his tone sharper now, "because it sure doesn't feel like it." I stood, the laundry forgotten, as I faced him. "John, please, don't," he interrupted, his voice rising. "Don't lie to me, Claire. I deserve better than that." The weight of his words broke something inside me, and the tears I'd been holding back spilled over. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. John stared at me, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief. "So it's true," he said, his voice hollow. "You and Mark." "Hello, you?" His eyes narrowed. "It wasn't supposed to happen," I said, my voice shaking. "I didn't mean for it to." "But it did," he said, cutting me off. "And now what? Do you love him?" "You?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and unforgiving. I didn't know how to answer, didn't know what the truth even was anymore. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I don't know anything anymore." "Yeah." John didn't say much after that. He packed a bag and left the house without another word, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing like a final goodbye. I stood in the empty living room, the weight of everything I'd done pressing down on me like a physical force. Everything. For the first time in weeks, I was truly alone. The silence was deafening, and the house that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison. I wanted to call Mark, to tell him everything, but I couldn't bring myself to pick up the phone. This was my mess, and I had to face it alone, as the days turned into nights, and back again. I found myself reflecting on the choices I'd made and the consequences they had wrought. The questions haunted me, and the answers remained just out of reach. The days stretched into a week, and the weight of John's absence was suffocating. The silence in the house was no longer a reprieve, but a constant reminder of the damage I had done. I spent most of my time pacing the rooms, each step stirring up memories of moments I couldn't take back. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from John. "We need to talk. I'll come by tomorrow." The simple message sent my heart racing. What would he say? Could there even be a way forward? Part of me dreaded the conversation, but another part, the part that still clung to hope, wanted to believe that we could find a way to rebuild. Instead, John arrived the next afternoon, his expression guarded as he stepped into the house. He carried himself with a calmness that was unnerving, as though he'd already decided how this would end. "Claire," he said, his voice steady, "we need to be honest with each other." I nodded, my hands twisting nervously in my lap. "I know." He sat across from me at the dining table, his gaze piercing. "I need to know the truth," he said. "Why? Why did you do it?" The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. I hesitated, searching for the words to explain the unexplainable. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "I felt lost. And Mark, he made me feel seen." John's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "I gave you everything," he said, his voice shaking. "Was it not enough?" "It wasn't about you," I said quickly, tears streaming down my face. "It was never about you. It was about me, about how I felt or didn't feel." His gaze snapped back to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. "And now what?" he asked. "Do you want to be with him? Is that what this is about?" "No," I said firmly. "I don't want to be with him. I want to fix this. I want us." Another nod. John leaned back in his chair, exhaling a shaky breath. "I don't know if that's possible," he said. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." The words cut deep, but I couldn't blame him for them. "I'll do whatever it takes," I said, my voice trembling. "I'll go to counseling. I'll give you space. Just don't give up on us." He didn't respond right away, and the silence between us was suffocating. Finally, he stood, his expression unreadable. "I need time to think," he said, heading for the door. As he left, I felt a flicker of hope amidst the devastation. He hadn't said no. A letter to Mark. That night, as I sat alone in the dimly lit living room, I realized there was one more thing I needed to do. I pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. "Mark, I don't know where to start, so I'll start with this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for leading you down a path we should have never taken. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused you and the pain I've caused myself. You made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, and for that I'll always be grateful. But we both knew this wasn't right. What we had, it wasn't real. It was a reaction to something missing in me, not a foundation for something lasting. I hope you find what you're looking for, and I hope you can forgive me one day. But I need to focus on fixing what I've broken. Goodbye, Mark." I folded the letter, sealing it in an envelope addressed to him. I would leave it at his door tomorrow. It was the least I could do to close this chapter once and for all. Over the next week, I threw myself into the work of repairing what was left of my marriage. I scheduled an appointment with a counselor, determined to confront the issues I'd been avoiding for years. I started journaling, trying to unpack the emotions that had led me to betray John in the first place. Ugh. John, true to his word, took his time to think. He stayed at a hotel, only texting me occasionally to check in. Each message was a lifeline, a sign that he hadn't given up entirely. When he finally agreed to meet with me again, it was at the counselor's office. We sat side by side on the couch, the distance between us both physical and emotional. But for the first time in what felt like forever, we were talking. Really talking. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. It was a crisp autumn morning when John came back home. His arrival wasn't accompanied by fanfare or declarations of reconciliation. Instead, he walked through the door carrying a duffel bag, his face solemn but determined. "I'm ready to try," he said simply, setting the bag down in the hallway. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Me too. The days that followed were not easy. We moved through the house like strangers at first, carefully navigating the fragile truce we'd established. There were moments of tension, when unspoken doubts lingered in the air, and moments of connection, when a shared glance or small gesture reminded us of what we used to have. Counseling became our anchor. Each session peeled back layers of resentment, misunderstanding, and pain. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about years of neglect, of taking each other for granted, of avoiding the hard conversations. I felt invisible, I admitted during one session, my voice trembling. Like I didn't matter anymore. John's expression softened, and for the first time, I saw the depth of his regret. "I didn't see it," he said quietly. "I was so focused on providing for us, I didn't realize I was losing you." It wasn't a fix-all, but it was a start. One afternoon, as I cleaned out a drawer in the bedroom, I came across the letter I'd written to Mark. I'd never delivered it, and seeing it now felt like an unfinished chapter in a story I desperately needed to close. Without overthinking it, I folded the letter into a fresh envelope and drove to the small apartment he'd rented in town. The drive was short, but the weight of what I was about to do made it feel endless. When I reached his door, I hesitated. What would I say if he answered? Would he be angry, hurt, or worse? Would he still care? But when the door finally opened, it wasn't Mark who greeted me. It was a young woman, her expression polite but curious. "Can I help you?" I was looking for Mark," I stammered. "He moved out a week ago," she said. "Didn't leave a forwarding address." I nodded, a mixture of relief and disappointment washing over me. "Thank you," I said, slipping the letter back into my bag. As I drove away, I realized that it didn't matter whether Mark ever read the letter. Writing it had been for me a way to let go, to acknowledge the choices I'd made and the consequences they'd wrought. John and I began to find our rhythm again, slowly but surely. We started spending more time together, small moments like cooking dinner or watching TV in the evenings. It wasn't the sweeping romance of our early years, but it was real, and it was enough. One evening, as we sat on the couch sharing a bottle of wine, John reached for my hand. "I want us to take a trip," he said, his voice tentative. "Just the two of us, somewhere new." I smiled, the warmth of his gesture spreading through me. "I'd like that." The trip wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, reminders of the cracks in our foundation, but it was a step forward. For the first time in months, I felt hope. Months turned into a year, and while the scars of what had happened never fully faded, they became a part of us, a reminder of how far we'd come. One evening, as we walked hand in hand through the park, John stopped suddenly, pulling me into a hug. "I love you, Claire," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm not going anywhere." Tears welled in my eyes as I held him close. "I love you too," I whispered. "And I'm sorry." The words weren't magic. They didn't erase the past or guarantee a perfect future, but they were honest, and they were ours. End of poem this delightful spring, read by the author. As we stood there, the cool evening breeze brushing against us, I realized that while the road ahead would be challenging, it was one I was willing to walk, hand in hand with the man I loved. Looking back, I don't think I'll ever fully understand why I did what I did. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was selfishness. Maybe it was a desperate attempt to feel alive. But I know this. The choices I made forced me to confront truths about myself I'd been avoiding for years. They made me see the cracks in my marriage, the parts of myself I'd lost, and the work it would take to rebuild. I don't believe in happily ever afters anymore. Life is messy, and love even more so. But I do believe in second chances. And as I look at John, his hand warm in mine, I know I've been given one. When I crossed the line with my stepbrother, I didn't just make a mistake. I shattered the life I thought I knew. What happens when a moment of weakness spirals into a truth too dangerous to hide? Stick around as I unravel the choices that led me to betray my husband and the devastating fallout that followed. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories like this one, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. You don't follow the number of words. What happens when crossing one forbidden line threatens to destroy everything you've built? That moment changed my life forever, and now I'm left wondering, can a betrayal this deep ever be forgiven? Stay tuned to find out, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Here's the turning point, written as a 1,000-word section that reflects the escalation of tension, and the weight of what I had done hung over me like a storm cloud, heavy and unrelenting. Mark was gone, but his absence didn't erase the memories of his touch, his words, or the moments we had stolen. I told myself I could move on, that I could bury the secret and salvage what was left of my marriage. But secrets have a way of seeping through even the strongest walls. But it started with small things: John's sidelong glances, his hesitant questions, his growing unease. He hadn't said anything outright, but I could feel his suspicion building, like a dam about to break. And then, one evening, it all came crashing down. It was late, and I was sitting at the dining table, pretending to go over bills, though the numbers on the page blurred together in a haze of anxiety. John walked in, his expression unreadable, and set his briefcase down on the counter with more force than usual. "Claire," he said, his voice low but firm, "we need to talk." The words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. "What about?" I asked, feigning nonchalance. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, his hands clasped tightly together. "About Mark?" I froze, my pulse quickening. "What about him?" John leaned forward, his gaze piercing. He's been gone for weeks, but something doesn't feel right. You've been distant, distracted, and I can't shake the feeling that there's something you're not telling me. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. "Claire," John said, his voice trembling slightly, "I need you to be honest with me. Did something happen between you and Mark?" The question hung in the air, and I felt the walls I'd carefully constructed begin to crumble. My instinct was to deny, to deflect, to do anything to protect the fragile illusion of our life together. But the look in John's eyes stopped me. He deserved the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. "Yes," I whispered, the single word shattering the silence. John's face fell, his hands clenching into fists. "How could you?" he demanded, his voice rising. "He's my stepbrother, Claire. My family. How could you do this to me?" Tears streamed down my face as I tried to explain, though the words felt hollow even to me. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said, my voice trembling. "I was lonely, John. You're always working, always gone. And he made me feel seen." John stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Seen," he repeated, his voice laced with bitterness. "So you thought the best way to fix that was to sleep with my stepbrother?" "I didn't plan it," I said desperately. "It just happened." "That's not an excuse," he shot back, his eyes blazing with anger. "Do you even realize what you've done? You've destroyed us, Claire. You've destroyed everything." John stormed out of the house, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence. I sat at the table for hours, replaying the confrontation in my mind. The look in his eyes, the hurt in his voice. It was more than I could bear. When he finally returned, it was past midnight. He didn't speak to me as he walked past, heading straight to the guest room and shutting the door behind him. The sound of the lock clicking was like a knife to my heart. The days that followed were a blur of cold silences and curt exchanges. John avoided me as much as possible, his presence in the house a constant reminder of the damage I'd done. I wanted to reach out to him, to beg for his forgiveness, but every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. One evening, as I walked through the grocery store, I saw him, Mark. He was standing by the produce section, his head bent over a shopping list. My heart raced as I debated whether to approach him or turn and leave. But he saw me first. "Claire," he said, his voice soft but tinged with surprise. "Mark," I replied, my voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" "Just grabbing a few things," he said, gesturing to the basket in his hand. "You?" "The same," I said, though my hands were empty. We stood there in awkward silence for a moment before he spoke again. "How's John?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "He knows," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "About us." Mark's expression shifted, a mix of guilt and concern. "Claire, It's over," I said, cutting him off. "Whatever this was, it's over. It has to be." It just felt like an endless loop. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, Claire, for everything." I wanted to believe him, but the damage was already done. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the aisle. That night, I found John sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up as I entered, his expression weary but less guarded than it had been in days. "We need to talk," I said, my voice shaking. He nodded, gesturing for me to sit. "I'm listening." I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "I know I've hurt you," I began, "and I know it's going to take time, but I want to fix this. I want us to fix this." John's gaze softened, though his eyes still held a trace of pain. "Claire," he said, his voice steady, "I don't know if I can trust you again." "I understand," I said, tears welling in my eyes, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn that trust back." He was silent for a moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Finally, he looked at me, his expression unreadable. "We'll take it one day at a time," he said. "That's all I can promise." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. The days following John's tentative agreement to work on our marriage were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. The air between us was heavy with unspoken tension, each conversation carefully measured to avoid reopening wounds that were still fresh and raw. Despite the fragility of our relationship, I clung to the hope that we could rebuild, one day at a time. John, however, was no longer the man who trusted me implicitly. He was guarded, his eyes scanning my face as if searching for cracks in my resolve. And I couldn't blame him. I had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and it would take more than words to repair the damage. My heart cracked. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dining table, John broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice steady but distant, "about counseling." I nodded, relief flooding through me. "I think that's a good idea." "It's not going to be easy," he warned, his gaze meeting mine. "There's a lot we need to work through." I know," I said, my voice trembling, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The next day, I scheduled our first session with a marriage counselor. The idea of laying our relationship bare in front of a stranger was terrifying, but I knew it was a necessary step if we had any hope of moving forward. Counseling begins. Our first session was awkward, to say the least. John sat with his arms crossed, his body language screaming defensiveness, while I struggled to find the right words to explain my actions. The counselor, a calm and composed woman named Dr. Riley, guided us gently but firmly, asking questions that forced us to confront the cracks in our marriage. "Claire," she began, her tone even, "can you tell me what led to your affair?" The question hung in the air, and I felt John's eyes on me, heavy with expectation. I took a deep breath, willing myself to be honest. "I felt invisible," I admitted. "John was always working, always busy, and I felt like I didn't matter anymore. Mark, he made me feel seen." John's jaw tightened, and I braced myself for his response, but instead of lashing out, he simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I didn't realize how much I was neglecting you," he said quietly. "But that doesn't excuse what you did." "I know," I said, tears streaming down my face. "And I'm not trying to justify it. I want to fix this." Dr. Riley intervened, her voice calm but firm. "Repairing a marriage after infidelity is a long process," she said. "It requires honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to rebuild trust, one step at a time. Are you both committed to that?" We nodded, our eyes meeting briefly before looking away. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was a start. Small steps forward. In the weeks that followed, John and I began to find our footing again. Counseling became a regular part of our routine, a safe space where we could voice our fears and frustrations without fear of judgment. The sessions were often painful, forcing us to confront the deepest wounds in our relationship. But they were also cathartic. Outside of counseling, we made a conscious effort to spend more time together. We started with small gestures, a shared cup of coffee in the morning, a walk around the neighborhood in the evening. These moments were tentative and awkward at first, but over time, they began to feel more natural. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, John reached for my hand. "I missed this," he said softly. "Just being with you." I squeezed his hand, tears welling in my eyes. I missed it too. It was a quiet moment, but it felt like a breakthrough. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope that we could find our way back to each other. A letter of closure. Despite the progress John and I were making, there was still one loose end I needed to address: Mark. His absence was a gaping wound in the story of our marriage, and I knew I couldn't truly move forward without finding closure. One night, after John had gone to bed, I sat down at the dining table with a pen and a sheet of paper. The words came slowly at first, but as I wrote, the emotions I'd been suppressing poured out onto the page. I don't know if he'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry for everything, for leading you down a path that was never meant to be, for the hurt we caused each other, and for the damage we inflicted on John. What we had, it was real in the moment, but it was never sustainable. It wasn't love. It was a reaction to loneliness, to unmet needs. I know that now. And I know that I need to let you go to truly move forward. I hope you find what you're looking for, Mark. And I hope you can forgive me as I'm learning to forgive myself. And so go find the house that makes you happy. I folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, unsure if I'd ever actually sent it. But writing it felt like a weight lifted from my chest, a step toward releasing the guilt that had been holding me hostage. Rebuilding trust. As the weeks turned into months, the trust between John and me began to slowly rebuild. It wasn't an easy process. There were still moments of doubt, of lingering hurt, but we were both committed to the work. So, one evening, as we sat together in the living room, John turned to me, his expression serious. "I want to believe we can get through this," he said, "but I need to know that you're all in, that there's no part of you still tied to him." I'm all in, I said firmly. Mark is in the past. You're my future. The words felt like a promise, and I meant them with every fiber of my being. For the first time in months, I saw a flicker of hope in John's eyes, and it gave me the strength to keep fighting for us. And thank God for that threatened betrayal of that trust, for I felt love moment that no lie could give a forth. A new beginning. A feeling of, as the seasons changed, so did we. The wounds of the past didn't disappear, but they began to heal, leaving behind scars that served as reminders of how far we'd come. Our marriage wasn't perfect. It never would be. but it was stronger, more honest, and more resilient than it had been before. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, John turned to me with a small smile. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "I think we're going to be okay." He smiled back, my heart swelling with gratitude. I think so too. In that moment, I realized that while the road ahead would still have its challenges, we were walking it together. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The sound of laughter echoed through the living room as John and I sat together on the couch, watching an old movie we'd seen a dozen times before. It was one of those moments that felt simple, yet profound, a reminder of what we had lost and what we were slowly finding again. His hand rested lightly on mine, a touch that carried the weight of all we had been through. The scars of my betrayal were still there, etched into the fabric of our marriage, but they were no longer the only thing defining us. Rebuilding hadn't been easy. There were still nights when I lay awake, consumed by guilt and doubt. Sometimes I glanced over at John, his face peaceful in sleep, and wonder if he would ever truly forgive me. Other times, I wondered if I would ever truly forgive myself. But every day we chose to move forward. We chose to fight for what we had, even when it felt impossibly fragile. The counseling sessions had been a lifeline. In that room, with a neutral third party guiding us, we'd said things we'd never dared to voice before. John admitted to feeling unappreciated, to burying himself in work because he didn't know how to navigate the growing distance between us. I confessed to my loneliness, to the aching void that had led me down a path I never imagined I would take. There were tears, there were arguments, but there were also breakthroughs. Slowly, the walls we'd built between us began to come down. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, John turned to me as we walked to the car. "I don't think I'll ever understand why you did what you did," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I believe you when you say you want to make things right." His words, though not an outright forgiveness, felt like a lifeline. I squeezed his hand, unable to speak through the lump in my throat, but he seemed to understand. At home, we made a point to spend more time together. It started small, sharing coffee in the mornings, taking evening walks around the neighborhood. But those moments began to feel like anchors, grounding us in the present and reminding us of why we fell in love in the first place. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, John turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" he asked. I nodded, smiling at the memory. We had just moved into the house, full of hope and plans for the future. His words stayed with me, and I resolved to show him that I was willing to put in the work. I surprised him with small gestures, a home-cooked meal waiting when he came home late, a handwritten note tucked into his briefcase. They were small things, but they seemed to matter. Slowly, the distance between us began to shrink, replaced by a tentative closeness that felt both familiar and new. One day, as we walked through the park, John stopped suddenly, turning to face me. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone serious. "I want us to take a trip, just the two of us, somewhere far away from everything, where we can just be." His suggestion caught me off guard, but the sincerity in his eyes melted any hesitation I felt. "I love that," I said, and for the first time in months, I saw him smile without reservation. The trip was far from perfect. There were moments of tension, of awkward silences, when the weight of our past loomed too large to ignore. But there were also moments of connection, walking hand in hand along the beach, laughing over a shared memory, staying up late talking about dreams we'd long since put on hold. It wasn't a magical fix, but it was a step forward, a reminder that healing was possible. As the months went by, the wounds of the past began to fade into the background. They didn't disappear. Scars never truly do, but they no longer felt like open wounds. John and I began to dream again, to make plans for the future that felt tangible and real. We talked about traveling more, about tackling home improvement projects, about finding ways to keep our connection strong. One night, as we lay in bed, John turned to me, his gaze steady. "I love you," he said simply. Tears welled in my eyes as I whispered the words back, feeling the truth of them in every fiber of my being. It was a quiet moment, but it felt monumental, a reminder that love could endure even the darkest of storms. Looking back, I don't think I'll ever fully understand what led me to betray the man I loved. Perhaps it was a culmination of unmet needs, of buried insecurities, of a desperate search for something I couldn't even name. But I've come to realize that the choices we make in moments of weakness don't have to define us. What matters is what we do next, the effort we make to repair the damage, to learn from our mistakes, and to become better versions of ourselves. Mark remains a shadow in my past, a chapter of my life that I've chosen to close. I haven't seen him since the day I left the letter at his door, and I don't know if I ever will. But I've made peace with that. What we had was fleeting, born out of loneliness and desperation, not love. And while I'll always carry the weight of those choices, I refuse to let them overshadow the life I'm building with John. Now, as I sit beside him on the couch, his hand warm in mine, I feel a sense of gratitude I never thought I'd experience again. Our marriage isn't perfect. It never will be. But it's real. It's built on honesty, on effort, on the shared understanding that love is a choice we make every single day. And as I look at him, his laughter filling the room, I know it's a choice I'll continue to make for as long as he's willing to make it with me.